Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. I am the librarian Katrina. Welcome to my channel. If you are new here, this is where I am reading through the enormous library of books you see behind me. Then I give you a quick synopsis and tell you what I think about them. So if you like books, just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos. Let me know what you think in the comments. So this week's book of the week joined my library in September of this year because my library is always growing because I have a problem. My husband and I are out to lunch and he shows me an ad for a book that is flashed across his screen and asks if I have it. And I say, no, I do not. Are you going to buy it? And he says, no. And I said, okay, fine. I'll buy it because I know you want to read it and I know you did that on purpose so that I would buy the book. And thus entered into my library this week's book of the week, The Last Viking, the true story of King Harald Hardrada by Don Hollway. And because I added booze a few weeks ago, I also have a Viking drink. Well, okay, it's not a Viking drink. It's a warm weather drink because I'm a crazy person and I went camping last night with a friend of mine. It was 20 degrees out. Camping sounded like fun, so we went camping and I needed something hot today. So today's drink is not quite a Viking drink, but I put a Viking twist into it, okay? The recipe is just, I think it's just called Morning Mud. I got it from a restaurant. You know, they had it on their menu and I thought, oh, I'll try that. Let's try that. The original one calls for vodka. I am going to be using aquavit. Boom. Havildsen aquavit in this case, which is a Norwegian. Aquavit is like the Norwegian version of vodka. So that's why I'm doing that. That's how I'm making it, you know, Viking appropriate. But let's do this. Now, I knew absolutely nothing about Harald Hardrada before buying this book. I mean, literally nothing. We'd use one shot of the vodka or aquavit, whichever you prefer, to your cup of coffee. So I knew nothing about him. And that's new, right? That's why you read. I didn't really know anything about Genghis Khan before I read last week's book of the week for the first time. And then I just kind of, you know, reread it because it was a good book. But anyways, this week's book, I knew nothing, and now I do. Harald Hardrada was born in 1015. The exact date is not known due to, I don't think there was initially any expectation that he was going to be sitting on the throne. He had his older brother Olaf, who was set to inherit, and he had two other older brothers besides Olaf, so he was like dead last. And because for him to even look at the throne, all of his older brothers and all of their children would have needed to die. Wow, okay. Ew, it's all this black stuff. So they didn't expect him, he didn't think he was going to be inheriting, and that's fine. But other than some indications when he was very young that he wanted to be a leader of men, there's not a whole lot of history from his youth. I mean, there just wasn't. There wasn't much that was going to be expected of him. So he first makes a real appearance in historical record at the Battle of Sticklestodd in 1030. Now, this battle is celebrated as occurring on July 29th in 1030, and I think it's still celebrated in Norway on July 29th. We also use a shot of Bailey's. So a shot of your vodka or aquavit, a shot of Bailey's. Due to multiple reports of a total eclipse of the sun occurring mid-battle, and this is both sides, everybody was reporting, hey, there was this eclipse during the middle of the battle, right? That's something that can be traced. And astronomically, the date of the battle was more likely to have occurred on August 31st. Now, the author, Don Hollway, provides a very reasonable explanation for the discrepancy, allowing for how days were counted back then, using something called the long 100, which is basically 120 versus 100. And I buy it because an eclipse is a fixed point in time. That's something that they can trace back and say, okay, this is the date this happened. So it's plausible. Now, Olaf had already been sitting on the throne of Norway when he was basically kicked out. And he was kicked out because he was trying to force the people of Norway to convert to Christianity. One of his heroes was Charlemagne, who insisted that everybody who followed him be Christian, and that worked out really well for Charlemagne. Did not work out so well for Olaf, and he was kicked out. So in 1030, he was trying to regain his throne, and that's what the battle was being fought for. He ended up being outnumbered by a significant margin by the heathens of Norway on the other side. Now, the combat, I mean, it's always iffy. It is not impossible to win against larger odds, right? Unless God calls down an eclipse upon you, which was interpreted two very different ways on the battlefield. So you got those who followed the current king, who was King Canute, who was not present on the battlefield, by the way. His forces were led by a Caliph Arneson, who had been a follower of Olaf's and then switched sides, went over to Canute. The followers of King Canute believe that this was basically like the Eye of Odin, looking down on the battlefield, which makes this battle really important to the heathens, because whoever Odin decides is going to win, that's going to be the king to follow. And if Odin picks Olaf, then that's going to have a huge conversion impact on the country, right? Those who followed Olaf saw it as a very dark sign, because they saw the eclipse as a sign that a holy man was about to die. And Olaf was struck down not too long after that, so that seemed prophetic. Basically, you top it off with, it's supposed to be heavy cream. I'm cutting back my fat, so I'm using half and half. So this is a twist on morning mud. And that's it. You mix it all together, and then you have a nice alcoholic beverage for the morning. So Olaf struck down, and his men broke and fled. All right, the leader's gone. There's no reason to stick around. Let's get the hell out of Dodge. Including 15-year-old Harald, who had been wounded. Now, history is not real specific on the type of wound, but it seems likely that it was a leg wound. Nothing permanent, because he later went on to become king and leader of men. But we don't know if it was stabbed, cut, broken, but whatever it was, it made running nearly impossible, so he had help from some of his men to get off the battlefield. He was at he located a farmhouse and basically paid them to let him stay there and recuperate. The other men fled, leaving Harald behind. Now, Harald did recuperate, eventually made his way into his sister-in-law's court in Sweden, and eventually to his other sister-in-law, who had married the Rus king, Yaroslav. It worked with aquavit. The vodka is probably a little more neutral. Aquavit tends to have a little more flavor to it, but it works with aquavit. There, once he was in Rus, Harald began to prove his mettle as leader of men. It was basically set to marry Yaroslav's daughter, Elisaveta. However, back in Norway, Canute's followers are starting to think that they may have made a mistake. Canute, when Canute died, his son... I put Sven in here. That's a typo. It should be Harda Canute. But Canute died, and basically maybe it was Sven. It must have been Sven. Anyways, he stepped up, was more or less ruled by his mother. I don't have her name in here, although it is in the book. And they were taxing people heavily, like very heavily. Canute was the king of Norway and Denmark. Whenever disputes rose between Norway and Denmark, the king and his mother tended to take the side of the Danes, and so the Norse were very unhappy with how things were playing out for them, and they're starting to think, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we're a little precipitous in kicking out that Christian nut, who incidentally is working his way towards sainthood by this point. Yes, he's dead, but that's one of the prerequisites of being a saint, is that you have to be dead. So he's working his way towards sainthood. The Norse are unhappy. One of the earliest historians of the time, Snorri Sturluson, he wrote the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, wrote, "Those who had not fought against King Olaf said, 'Now take your just reward and treatment from Canute's people, you men of Trondelag, who fought against King Olaf and wrested away his kingdom. You were promised peace and honor, but got nothing but tyranny and slavery for your treason and misdeeds.'" That, incidentally, nothing changes. Historically, it's been 1,000 years, and that is the 11th century version of, I didn't vote for him, he's not my president. Nothing changes. Humanity sucks. We never learn. We never learn from history. We just suck. So Norway is again looking for a replacement. They are done with the Canute line. They want Olaf's line back, but Olaf, of course, is dead. And they sent Kalf Arneson to Rus, but not to find Harald, who was 19 years old, most definitely considered a man and a leader of men. They go there to locate Olaf's 10-year-old son, Magnus, with the expectation that Magnus and his mother, Alfhild, will be biddable and easily controlled. And this is logical, right? I mean, he is the son. But Harold's complaint was that Magnus was not born in wedlock. He was a bastard born. Harald feels like his claim is stronger, even though he's not a direct descendant of Olaf. He's Olaf's brother. Regardless, Magnus and Alfhild head back to Norway, and now Harold's prospects are a little dimmer. So he had been set to marry Yaroslav's daughter Elisaveta, and now Yaroslav says, we're going to put the stop on that for now. We're not saying no, definitely. We're just saying for now, you've got no land, no kingdom, no money. You're basically a penniless prince. Show me something. Show me that you will be a king and a leader of men, and I'll give you my daughter. Harald takes 500 followers and goes to Constantinople. They called it Miklagard, Constantinople, Istanbul. It's all the same city. It was the shining heart of the Byzantine Empire. Once there, he and his 500 followers sought to join the Varangian Guard. Now, the Varangian Guard were sort of like elite mercenaries, but with honor, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron. Mercenaries can be bought, right? So how can they possibly have honor? Well, they have honor by staying bought. I mean, once they accept your coin, they're the very best, and they're absolutely loyal. Hollway even recounts one apocryphal story, I don't know if this one's true or not, where the guard comes into a room where an emperor who they were supposed to be guarding had just been assassinated by his heir. And I mean, like, literally, they found the heir standing over the body with the bloody knife. And the guard immediately began guarding the heir, because their job is to guard the emperor, not to extract justice for the dead. That's an interesting twist. Now, Harald and his men were in Constantinople as part of the Varangian Guard for somewhere between 9 and 10 years. The timeline's a little fuzzy. I mean, again, it's a 1,000-year-old history, and most of the sources, and in fact, I think all the sources from which the information is reported, were themselves written anywhere from 50 to 200 years after the events they portray. So the sources need to be taken with a grain of salt, but they're fairly good, all things considered. Now, for all of that, Hollway does a really good job laying out what he thinks happened and why he reached those conclusions. So the things he believes happened is that Harald was immediately accepted into the guard, even though he did not approach as a Prince of the Rus. He worked under a pseudonym Nordbricht, meaning like a break with the North, so he's kind of repudiating his past. That he was, while he was eventually identified as an unlanded Prince of the Rus, he was allowed to rise in the guard, because where was he going to go? He didn't have any land, and he was competent and efficient at what he did. But among the reasons he rose was that the Empress Zoe was infatuated with him. And they may have had a decade-long affair, despite there being like a 30 to 40-year age difference between them. She was considerably older than Harald. All of those things, combined with the known history of the Varangian Guard, tells a tale of a well-traveled man. Seriously, when he was with the Guard, Harald honed his leadership skills and combat skills and became very formidable, and his men followed him willingly from Constantinople to Jordan, Jerusalem, Egypt, up through Italy. He was seriously better traveled than a good chunk of today's population. Now, this entire section was basically a crash course on 11th century Byzantium, because Byzantine is where Harald was. When he arrived in Constantinople, Emperor Michael IV had just been crowned. The Empress was Zoe, and Michael IV ascended the throne due to his marriage to Zoe, because she was the inheritor. She was the royalty. She had the ability to put him on the throne. He was her second husband, the first having died, most likely poisoned by Michael, with Zoe's blessing. By the time Harald left, 2 more emperors will have sat on the throne. So times changed very fast in Constantinople back then. When Michael IV died, his successor, who I think was his nephew, had been legally adopted by Zoe. She never had any children of her own, so he was legally adopted by Zoe, who put him on the throne as Michael V. Michael V was politically inept, and he believed all he needed was to be on the throne, and he had all the power, and all he needed was the backing of the aristocracy. So he banned the aristocracy who disagreed with him, put in sycophants. Everybody who was with him had to kiss his royal hiney. Then he banished Zoe to a nunnery, and this was a grave social error. The common man adored Zoe. The people of Constantinople, they thought she was the best, and they thought she was wonderful, and the sun rose and set on her. So when he banished her to a nunnery, having, clipped all of her hair off, the entire population of Constantinople rioted. All of them. The rioting lasted for days. Michael realized his mistake. Zoe was returned from the nunnery. However, the people could not tell if she was coerced into saying that this was all with her approval or not. So they were like, we don't like that guy. He's an asshole. We're going to bring in your younger sister, Theodora. Now, Theodora was also in a nunnery, but hers was by choice, and she'd been there for decades at that point. But she recognized the winds of fate were changing. When the people came for her, she went with them and said, okay, yes, I am now the empress. Zoe and Theodora absolutely despised each other, but they recognized their survival was contingent on each other, and so Michael was forced out, sent to be a monk, and the empresses were forced to work together for the good of the realm. Throughout all of this, we don't actually know what Harald's movements were, but based on his position within the Varangian Guard, Hollway makes some decent assumptions of what his movements may have been. and he's always very careful to write in the past perfect tense to denote where assumptions are being made versus where records from sources say he was and what happened. And he also points out when sources contradict each other and why he chooses the information he does. So when the dust settles after Michael V's forced abdication, Theodora refused to marry. But they still needed a man to sit on the throne because 11th century men sat on the throne. So Zoe took a third husband, Constantine IX, who was about 15 years younger than Zoe. She was a cougar. She had a total thing for younger men. When Constantine IX showed up, he had a mistress of his own, Maria. Zoe didn't care about that. She was like, hey, I don't have to have sex with you. Fine, you bring Maria. I totally don't care, because she wanted to continue her affair with Harald. However, when Harald and Maria met, apparently there were sparks, which the royal couple did not approve of, right? Harald is for Zoe, Maria is for Constantine. They should not be together. Maria was ultimately brought to live in the palace, and again, Zoe didn't care, but the thought being that she's now under Constantine's direct eye and supervision also meant she was under Harold's direct eye and supervision because he was the head of the Varangian Guard at this point. Ultimately, he ended up being, well, he resigned his position because he heard that his nephew might need assistance consolidating his claim to the throne in Norway, Denmark, and England. So he resigns his position. And about this time, his affair with Maria is heating up, and so he's, rather than being allowed to resign and get out of Dodge or Constantinople, they check his ass in jail because, I don't know. Fortunately for him, at the same time, the Rus brought an invasion force down. Hollway speculates that Harald may have been acting as a spy and sending information to the Rus. He may have been. That's certainly plausible. Okay. Unfortunately, he didn't get to telling them all about the defenses of Constantinople because the Rus were handily defeated because of the harbor, which had a harbor chain across it, making it impossible for boats to get in or out unless that chain is dropped. And the Byzantines also used Greek fire, which we don't know what the formula for Greek fire is. That has been lost for centuries, but it was like an early version of napalm, basically, and it never stopped burning. Harald and his men missed all of this because they were in prison when the Rus showed up. And then the most remarkable thing happened. While they are in prison, they are broken out of jail by an unnamed lady who had apparently been visited by Saint Olaf. Harald's older brother had been working his way towards sainthood. Like I said, it's been 15 years since he died, and apparently he wanted Harald out of prison and heading north. So Harald and his men are broken out of prison. Rather than making a straight run to the harbor, he goes to the palace and takes Maria with him. Now, Hollway thinks that he took her because they were in love, and certainly it's entirely possible, but it's equally possible that she was the better hostage choice, given that she was the beloved of Constantine IX. And so the remaining Varangian would be less likely to sink Harald's ship with Maria on board. So that's another possible explanation. You might think he would have taken Zoe, but they already had two empresses. Zoe was kind of a spare at this point. The guard might have hesitated, but since Michael was out there kind of patrolling too, it's just as likely that Maria was a good hostage. So, now, that chain that was drawn across the bay precludes ships from entering or leaving the harbor unless the chain is lowered. There is a way over the chain, but it only has like a 50% success rate, so it's iffy, right? When you flip a coin, you may or may not die doing this. Basically, you have to hit the chain dead center at speed, shifting all of the weight to one side of the ship to allow the other side to clear it. Then you have to, like, boom, run to the other end to shift the weight forward so you can make it over the chain. And if you don't time it just exactly right, the ship's going to crack in two and you're going to lose everything. Harald's ship made it. His second ship did not. And everybody wearing armor sunk to the bottom of the harbor immediately. Those who weren't wearing armor were pulled onto Harald's ship and they made their way back to the north. Somewhere in there, they ended up dropping off Maria. I don't know, Hollway thinks it was at her request because she did love Constantine. She loved Harald, but she also loved Constantine. Maybe it was. Maybe she'd served her purpose as a hostage. But they dropped her off. They didn't need her anymore, and they went north. He returned to Kiev. He did not go straight to Norway. He returned to Kiev, a very wealthy man. Apparently, Yaroslav was honorable. And in addition to whatever information Harold may or may not have been sending about Constantinople, he'd been sending his plunder and pay from his time in Constantinople for several years, and Yaroslav had been saving it for him. And that's actually pretty good tactically for Yaroslav, because if he just confiscates it and takes it for himself, then he's going to have a guy who's been fighting battles for a decade show up on his doorstep mad as hell that he's now stolen all of his money. Instead, he saves it for him and says, hey, you've now proven yourself, you've got wealth, you've been sort of invited back to Norway, why don't you marry my daughter Elisaveta? Which Harold did, with a heavy bride price, not uncommon back then. I know that there are people who are pissed about the fact that that existed back then, but it was not, it was a dowry, right? You pay the bride price, you get the bride, she gets part of her dowry back, and that's under her control, and so that is how marriages of the state were handled. So Harold and Elisaveta are married, and now he's a prince without a throne. He's a wealthy warrior, he's looking to find his place in the world. The Scandinavian kingdoms, meanwhile, have been noisily growing more divided. Sweden remained its own country, so this is specifically Norway and Denmark. I really don't know what is on my hands. That's really disturbing. All right, so they're growing divided. Sweden's its own country, sort of England, although that is not really Scandinavian. It's kind of like for centuries, the King of France would claim that he was also the King of England, and the King of England would say he was also the King of France. So it's, prove it. Harold's nephew Magnus at this point has been ruling more or less since 1035, when Harold left for Constantinople, so about 10 years. Magnus, while certainly not scared to fight, is more of a peacemaker. So the king his father had been fighting was Canute the Great. He died in 1035, which is how Magnus pulled back in. And this was Canute's heir, Hardrada, eventually reached an agreement with Magnus that whichever of them died first, the other is going to be the heir. So Hardrada dies in 1042, and Magnus claims the throne of England and Denmark, along with his already existing throne of Norway. However, in Denmark, we have another Sven who also has a claim to the throne, and this becomes a source of contention. And so that's why Magnus needed help consolidating his throne, because you have this other contender, Sven, saying, no, I should really have the throne. And Magnus is saying, no, I'm the king of Norway and Denmark and England. So Harold first approaches his nephew, because family first, about wanting a throne. And Magnus and his advisors basically laughed him out of court. They're like, no, we got this, we don't need you. So Harold goes to Sven. And they agree that they're going to take on Magnus, funded by Harold. Harold would take Norway, Sven would take Denmark. And Magnus goes, oh, buddy, brother, maybe I was precipitous in kicking you out of court. How about this? What if I sell you half of Norway and we'll be co-kings? So you give me half your gold, I'll give you half the country, and we'll be co-kings. And Harold goes, okay, yeah, because I'm cash rich, but I don't have a lot of men. I still only have about 500 men. So yes, that's to my advantage. I lose some gold, but I'm gaining half a country. I'll get that back in taxes, no problem. So he picks a fight with Sven as a way to back out of their agreement and goes to Norway, where he was not the easiest of co-kings with Magnus. He was always pushing the boundaries of what they had agreed upon, and he always wanted more. He was always pushing for more. Magnus the Good died young. He died about 23 years old, and on his death, he gave the rest of Norway to Harold, and then gave Denmark to Sven. Harold was not pleased by this. He thought he should have it all. And he spent the next several years raiding Denmark, trying to kick Sven out. Sven, for his part, was a pretty good king. On the other hand, he could hardly do worse than Harold, who raided Denmark so frequently that he basically bankrupted the nation and destroyed all trading outposts, putting Scandinavia behind market advancement by decades. After he had so thoroughly destroyed the nation, Harold managed to set a date for an actual battle with Sven. And as had happened in the past, Sven was not at the assigned rendezvous, so Harold, assuming Sven was not coming, cuts his farmers loose and says, okay, go back and finish farming. We're going to, raid the cows or something, because there's not any gold left. We already got all that, but we're going to just steal some more chickens. Which is what Sven was waiting for, because now he had Harold outnumbered by 2-1. Now this was a sea battle, so it was fought by ship, and they were pretty careful in fighting by ship because they wanted to keep those ships. Those ships were solid merchandise, right? So there wasn't any fire. It was very much a means of, let's kill all the people so we can get the ships. And I was really hoping that 2-1 margin would put Sven in the victor's seat. Did not. And that was the result of Harald's Jarl Hakon Ivarsson, who was an absolute rock star. He basically circled the battle in his ships and kept the wings clear from Sven's boats and troops so they couldn't get overrun. And the history of Hakon and Harald was a bit twisty, which led to an act of mercy on Hakon's part that would come back to bite him in the behind. Hakon was set to marry Harald's niece, Ragnhild Magnusdottir. I'm really sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Only Harald would not let the marriage go through unless Hakon were landed, like being a Jarl. But Norway already had one Jarl, and Harald refused to create a second position. He's like, no, we already got one Jarl, so you go out and find a Jarldom somewhere, and I'll give you Ragnhild. So Hakon goes to Sven and sought refuge there. This was all prior to the battle, obviously. Now, prior to the battle, the existing Jarl died. And so Harald is looking at this and goes, okay, hey, come on back to my side. I'll let you marry Ragnhild, and you can have the Jarldom, and you'll be on my side when this battle goes down with Sven. And that was good maneuver on his part, because Hakon really did turn the tide and help make sure that Harald ended up winning. But Hakon's fighting on Harald's side when he recognizes Sven trying to abandon the field of battle. Sven realizes he's losing, and he wants to get out with his life, so he's trying to leave. And Hakon helps him escape, because he had sought succor with Sven. Sven granted it to him, so he returned the kindness. Again, this displeases Harald. Once the battle's over, Harald is now definitively the king of Norway and Denmark. The people in Norway granted the bulk of the success to Hakon's actions during the battle. And Harald resents this because he doesn't like anybody showing him up. So to try and make the people of Norway pay for their ingratitude, he begins taxing at a very heavy rate, which makes the people of Hakon's earldom rebel, because why should they pay taxes to him? They're already paying taxes to Hakon and get the money from Hakon. And Harald's like, y'all talk an awful lot of shit for people with highly flammable houses. And then he hears that Hakon helped Sven escape, and he charges Hakon with treason. Hakon runs to Sweden. Harald swoops in, continues the taxation and raiding of his own people. Basically, Harald was kind of a garbage human being. He was not in line for any succession. He bullied his way into the throne. I mean, Magnus was, yes, born out of wedlock, but Olaf recognized him, which legitimized Magnus and made his claim to the throne legitimate. Harald certainly had no claim on Denmark. I mean, he was basically a warlord. He raided his own people. He taxed the lifeblood out of those that weren't raided. He was envious of anyone's success and prone to react violently when anyone might show him up in any capacity. He wanted to be the best in everything, and there's nothing wrong with that, but when he wasn't the best, instead of going, okay, how can I learn? How can I become better? He just beat them down. I mean, he was just not a good guy. When Hakon fled, he fled to Sweden, which was a good move on his part because there had been several royal deaths since then, and now Harald no longer had any relation to the throne of Sweden. So following Hakon into Sweden would have been an act of war. So Hagen stays hiding in Sweden. Harald made actual peace with Sven, getting him the king, the throne of Denmark. And in 1066, a new ship makes its way up the fjord in Norway. It was an Anglo-Saxon ship, which is captained by Tostig, who said he needed help retaking the throne of England from his brother Harald, or family rivalry. And despite everyone on the voyage having premonitions of failure and death, Harald and his men traveled to England, where they were slaughtered, like almost to a man. The invading force traveled on 300 ships. The survivors needed 27 to return to Norway, and they got their heinies handed to them by the Harald in England, who was himself almost immediately slaughtered by William the Conqueror in 1066. So 1066 was a hallmark year in England. They had quite a few changeovers there. Harald was survived by one daughter, Ingigerd, She was his daughter by Elizaveta. He had two daughters by Elizaveta. The other one, Maria, allegedly died at the same moment that Harald did. So that's part of the legend surrounding the man. He also had two sons by his consort. The consort this was legally recognized, and back then it was believed that if, basically women could you would have women who gave birth to only daughters, women who gave birth to only sons, and then some women who could give birth to both. And when Elizaveta had two girls, he assumed that she was never going to give him a son, so he went and found another wife to act as a consort, and she gave him two sons, so that kind of bore out their belief. His two sons were Magnus II and Olaf II, and they were left as co-kings in Norway. Magnus II died at 21, leaving Olaf the Peaceful to rule for an astonishing 23 years. And Harald kind of passed into legend at that point. I will say the author's final thoughts, as encapsulated in the epilogue, were pretty eloquent. I was like, yes, he got this exactly right, so I'm going to quote it directly. As in Byzantium, a millennium past, men who were once called heroes are cast down and called villains, while scoundrels are held up to acclaim, all according to the prevailing narrative of the day. The hindsight of 1,000 years offers little clarity when none but the dead can know the ultimate truth. And it's spot on, man. That's exactly what history is. And we are, in the present, are all too prone to judging the past based on the morals of today. And you really can't. You weren't there 1,000 years ago to know what hard choices had to be made, boom, right now in the moment. So, and you weren't there 200 years ago to know those same points. I did not like Harald. I thought he was a complete bastard. By what I read of him, I thought, ew, what a scumbag. But, in a time when weak men are creating hard times, I could see where others might turn to him for inspiration, because we need hard men to pull our butts out of the metaphorical fire that we find ourselves in. There are an awful lot of weak men out there spouting off, so I can see where Harald might be an inspiration for some. But might I recommend you gentlemen look to Genghis Khan instead? I mean, he at least spread culture, he didn't destroy it. Thank you all for watching. Again, my name is Katrina. I will see you guys next week. Bye.